Simon & Schuster Audio presents Enemy at the Gates, a Mitch Rapp novel by Vince Flynn and Kyle Mills. Read by George Guidell.
Prologue. Southwestern Uganda. Lucky. Many years ago, Dr. David Chisholm had pledged to never take his good fortune for granted, that at least once per day he would give thanks to whatever cosmic force had taken him under its wing. He rolled down the window of his embarrassingly luxurious Toyota Land Cruiser, stuck his hand out into the 73-degree air, and gave the world a thumbs up. There was no reaction from the Emerald Mountains, terraced farmland, or red dirt road, but they knew that he understood the gifts he'd been given. Based on his bland suburban upbringing, the fact that he was even in this place was a minor miracle. His parents were both accountants and absolutely loved everything about that profession and lifestyle. The interminable columns of numbers and teetering tax forms, the complex machinations of the upper middle class. Their elaborate strategies for not only keeping up with the Joneses, but one day becoming the Joneses. Despite all that, they'd been, and still were, solid, conventional parents. If only he'd been a solid, conventional child, everything would have gone smoothly. It wasn't for lack of trying on his part. Chisholm had still been in grade school when he first noticed how their brows furrowed when he brought up his fascination with science. It had started with evolutionary biology, and endless hours speculating about the creatures natural selection would give rise to on other planets. Then it was physics and the mysteries of gravity. And finally, it was everything. Why does this rock look different than that rock, Mom? Hey, Dad, what makes my Frisbee stay in the air? Miss Davidson, if Superman can fly at almost the speed of light and hold his breath for 1 minute, could he make it to the sun? By the time he entered junior high, he'd learned to hide those interests, to feign enthusiasm for bank entries and for joining the family business after graduating from an economical local university. From there it would be a McMansion, 2.5 children, and a country club membership, all the things sane people aspire to. In secret, though, he'd continued to pursue his passion. Increasingly advanced books borrowed from the library were hidden under a bunch of comics in his closet. Subscriptions to scientific journals were paid for from his allowance and addressed to the house of a friend. Eventually, his obsession with virology had relegated all other fields to little more than passing interests. It was that discipline he dove into every night after doing a calculatedly unspectacular job on his homework. Some of the things he read, though, he disagreed with. Most of the problems weren't with a lack of accuracy per se, but more with a lack of imagination. Finally, a particularly glaring omission relating to how viruses defend themselves drove him crazy enough to write a lengthy complaint to a journal he'd subscribed to. To his great surprise, it was published. Then it started getting a lot of attention. Finally, a reporter managed to see through the carelessly created pseudonym he'd used and tracked him down. Chisholm grinned and shook his head in the confines of the car. In retrospect, using Elmer Fudd and putting his real return address on the envelope was the smartest move he'd ever made. After that, everything had been a whirlwind, explaining to his stunned parents why there was someone at the door wanting to talk to their 14-year-old son about immunology. Entry into Stanford a few months later, medical degree, Ph.D., the immediate appointment as the head of a research project that demanded political and fundraising skills that were well beyond him. A scientific community full of geriatric bastards who pushed back against his revolutionary ideas. Finally, burnout at 23, and the beginning of his less than productive drugs, booze, and women phase. After his second overdose, he'd awoken in the hospital determined to get his life together. It hadn't been difficult to find an NGO that would take a scientist of his reputation who was willing to go to whatever shithole or hotspot they could dream up, and that had ushered in his somewhat more productive infectious disease war and poverty phase. It had been a huge rush, and he'd loved the remote locations, the chaos, the danger. Most of all, though, he'd loved the feeling of moving away from pure theory and helping flesh and blood people. It was likely he'd still be out there somewhere if it hadn't been for a chance meeting with the infamous Nicholas Ward. Or maybe it hadn't been chance. He'd never gotten a reliable beat on that. Chisholm slowed as he crested the mountaintop, looking out across the stunning valley below. The intensity of the forest against the sky, the geometric blocks denoting agriculture, the craggy cliffs and clouds building on the horizon. What really captured his imagination, though, was a distant cluster of buildings to the east. They were another example of the ridiculous serendipity that tended to cling to him even when he was screwing up. The facility was state-of-the-art in the truest sense, benefiting from unlimited funds provided by one of the few people in the world smarter than he was. It served as a regular hospital to the rural communities around it, but also as a research facility developing a new approach to fighting viral infections. The potential contribution to mankind was incredible, with the possibility that a single vaccine could wipe out the entire coronavirus category. If he could make it work, COVID, SARS, YARS, and even the common cold would become a thing of the past. The location was a little more remote and unstable than he would have liked, but there were no workable alternatives. In its early stages, the vaccine had potential side effects that the local population was immune to. No one was sure why, probably a coronavirus epidemic that predated recorded history. But it didn't really matter. Relocating to Uganda and recruiting volunteers here had pushed his research forward a good 5 years. Chisholm navigated down the mountain while scanning the dense trees that lined the road. Despite numerous expeditions into the back country, he'd never managed to spot a gorilla. Duikers, a potentially new species of butterfly, and endless red-tailed monkeys, yes, but still not so much as a glimpse of the crown jewel of Uganda's wildlife. Not that he was worried. One day they'd make an appearance at the edge of the forest, all lined up and in perfect morning light. Just like one day he'd find a supermodel with a thing for geeky scientists broken down by the side of the road. That was just the way his life went. When Chisholm pulled up to the front of the facility's research wing, Mukisa Odongo was waiting for him out front. The former Ugandan army doctor was a rock in every way. At 50, his 6'5" frame was still intimidatingly solid, and his eyes had a way of ferreting out any employee not giving 100%. Despite the fact that the man was yet another gift from God, Chisholm was a little afraid of him. In theory, this was his operation. But everybody knew Odongo ran it. Probably to the benefit of all those involved, frankly. "What's up, Mookie?" Chisholm said as he climbed out of the Land Cruiser. "It's a gorgeous day. Our last trials went even better than expected, and the birds are singing. Why do you always look so unhappy?" "We're hearing rumors of guerrilla activity in the area." "Finally! I've got my backpack in the car. Let's give ourselves a couple days off and go check them out." "Not guerrilla activity, David. Guerrilla activity. Terrorists." Chisholm froze. "Oma? No way. He never comes this far east." "Gideon comes and goes as he pleases." Gideon Oma was a psychopath who had a category all to himself. He'd spent years building his clandestine army from a small, twisted cult into a force capable of wreaking havoc on the local population. He burned villages, kidnapped children, and generally raped, tortured, and mutilated his way across the region. Terrorist activity had been a consideration in the placement of this hospital, prompting them to locate it as far east as the terrain would allow. Oma preferred to stick close to the dense forests around the Congolese border, crossing back and forth in a conscious effort to use the animosity between the DRC and Uganda to prevent any kind of coordinated action. Are we talking credible rumors or just the normal gossip? "That's what I'm trying to determine," Odongo said. "Right now we're doing an additional backup of the computer systems and categorizing all critical research items for potential emergency removal. We'll have trucks here on standby tomorrow." "You think that's necessary?" "Probably not. The truth is that we've treated a number of Alma's people in the time we've been here. Combat wounds, disease, drug overdoses. Our continued operations benefit him more than an attack on us." "We treat his people? Why didn't I know that?" "It's not your business, David. You don't understand my country. In Uganda, peace is a delicate balancing act. Taking sides isn't wise. Even against the devil? The African ran a hand thoughtfully across his cleanly shaven head. Yes, my friend. Even against the devil. The stark white hallway was empty, as were most of the rooms it serviced. Apparently, everyone who could walk under their own power had decided to bug out back to their villages. Worrying. When he'd used the word gossip with Odongo, it hadn't been meant in an entirely pejorative way. In Africa, you ignored the local chit-chat at your own risk. When Chisholm entered the main lab, it felt almost abandoned. Precaution was starting to look a lot like evacuation. How serious was this? You could never tell with Odongo. He'd face a nuclear war with the same disapproving frown as he aimed at the mold taking hold on the cafeteria ceiling. Seems quiet, he said as he came through the glass door. Jing Yu spun, nearly dropping the box she was holding. You're here. Have you heard? Gideon Alma is close. At 33, she was 1 year his senior, but looked much younger. He'd raided her from a research facility in Wuhan, and she'd proven to be worth her weight in gold. If only he could decipher her accent. What? Gideon Alma, he's here. My understanding is that there are some rumors about him being in the area, that's all. We're just being careful. A man appeared from a door at the back, dragging a handcart. It's about time you got here. Did you stop on top of the mountain again? Matteo Ricci was a brilliant virologist from Milan who had been coaxed out of retirement by ridiculous amounts of money. In contrast to Liu's, whose appearance could be described as slightly startled minimalism, Ricci had a great tan, amazing hair, and could still genuinely rock the ass-hugging slacks he favored. Today, a cigarette hung from his lips, putting a finishing touch on his aging pop star vibe. Apparently, he decided that the proximity of Gideon Alma trumped any rules against smoking in the lab. What are we doing? Chisholm said, ignoring the comment about his tardiness. Odongo gave us a list, Ritchie responded in his lightly accented, grammatically rigid English. Procedures for what needs to go and when. They've prioritized getting non-critical personnel and stable patients out of here, but it sounds like we're going to be moving equipment and live samples tomorrow when the trucks arrive. Chisholm laced his fingers thoughtfully atop his head. Were they overreacting here? The reasonably healthy patients and non-essential employees, sure. No point in taking chances. But a lot of the other stuff wasn't all that easy to transport, and there's no reason someone like Alma would want it. It wasn't like there was a big market in the jungle for incubators and test tubes. Having said that, if Mukisa Odongo had spoken, that was it. The momentum of his edicts was irresistible. Like a hurricane, they just swept you along, whether you liked it or not. Odongo stood well back from the window, staring into the dimly lit parking area. The rain was coming down even harder now, creating a haze of heavy droplets and swirling fog. The helicopter should have been there hours ago, but one of the bureaucratic glitches so common in Kampala had caused a delay. And now it was too late. All aircraft was grounded due to the weather, and forecasts suggested that they would stay that way until just before dawn. Chisholm and his team should have been long gone, but instead they were going through the mundane exercise of packing and categorizing research materials in preparation for them to be moved to a more secure location. It was an effort that would likely prove pointless beyond keeping them occupied. Odongo's grandfather had taught him that the darkness hid evil spirits, intent on making the living suffer. And those superstitions, so easy to laugh off as his education had advanced, now manifested themselves. His informants in the surrounding villages were reporting the appearance of people who could only have been sent by Gideon Alma. They were sticking to the forest for now, but taking positions along the main road that led there, cutting off escape and isolating the facility from anyone who could offer assistance. This was his mistake, his fault. He should have ordered an evacuation the moment the rumors started. But he'd prioritized the continuity of Chisholm's work, concerned about the setbacks an evacuation could cause. A flash of light became visible through the window, likely a few hundred meters distant. The strobe effect was accompanied by the unmistakable sound of automatic rifle fire. It had begun. Odongo used the laptop on his desk to activate the facility's alarms and strode purposefully from his office. The few staff members remaining were volunteers, and all understood their roles perfectly. He felt great pride in seeing them work, removing IVs, stabilizing wounds, moving critical patients from beds to more maneuverable stretchers. They would carry them into the rain and scatter, trying to keep them alive as they were transferred to nearby villages that he prayed Alma would ignore. Everything seemed to come into a sharp focus. The traditional pattern of the floor tiles, the scent of the rain filtered through the building, the efficient movements of the people who had been courageous enough to stay. It was incredible that a world with so much darkness could also have so much light. He spotted Chisholm rushing up the corridor, having abandoned the busy work he'd been assigned in the lab. "What's going on, Mukisa? What's the alarm mean?" "Alma's here." The fear on the young scientist's face was clearly visible, but didn't rise to the level of panic. He wasn't as pampered as the others. The boy had lived through hard times, some self-inflicted, but hard nonetheless. While he'd never experienced anything like Gideon Alma's army, it wouldn't be completely unimaginable to him. The other two, though, would have no context for what was coming. He prayed they would be spared. "We need to get the rest of the patients out of here, Mukisa. It's all taken care of, David. What's important now is that we make sure you're safe to carry on your work." He put a hand on Chisholm's shoulder, leading him back down the hallway toward the lab. Matteo Ricci and Jing Liu were standing by the boxes they'd packed, looking a little stunned. Odongo motioned through the glass for them to follow, and they obeyed. Their questions were rendered unintelligible by their accents mixing with the wail of the alarm, prompting Odongo to put a finger to his lips. They fell silent and allowed themselves to be led to the eastern side of the facility. Chisholm finally spoke up when they entered a small room filled with cleaning supplies. "I don't mean to question you, Mukisa, but what are we doing here? There's no way out, not even a window." By way of answer, Odongo moved a bucket and mop from the back of the space, feeling around for a hidden handle and opening a hatch. "What's this?" Chisholm said. "Get in." "What?" "No one but me knows about this place, and Alma's people won't be able to find it. Wait overnight. The weather's scheduled to clear in the morning, and help will come. Alma won't risk a confrontation. He'll leave before they arrive." "What about you?" Chisholm said, looking down at the shadowy hole. "I have other things to attend to." "What are you talking about? There's plenty of room. I'm not going down there if you—"
"You are going down there," Odongo corrected. "Like I said earlier, this isn't your country, David. You take care of your business, and I'll take care of mine."
They locked eyes for a moment, but then Chisholm looked away. The other two were already descending the ladder. "Will we see each other again?" Chisholm asked.
"Of course. But I hope not too soon."
Odongo was shoved from behind, but didn't stumble. The two gorillas ushering him toward the front of the building were both in their early teens and lacked the weight to move him. What they did possess, though, was the thoughtless sadism that was unique to child soldiers. The facility's main doors loomed ahead, and he passed through them into the rain. The group waiting was as ragtag as he expected, clothed in everything from surplus combat gear to jeans and sandals. All, of course, carried the cheap AK-47s favored by terrorists the world over. A few also wielded machetes. He counted 25 people in total, 19 of Alma's guerrillas, 4 captured hospital workers, and 2 unconscious patients lying in stretchers that were slowly sinking into the mud. Everyone was soaked to the bone, and most were starting to shiver. It was a good sign. When Alma sent his troops on one of his infamous genocidal raids, they were generally high on a drug locally known as ajali. Under its influence, they felt no fear, no pain, no doubt, and certainly no cold. The dull messianic glow around Alma became blinding, and they would do anything for him, run until their hearts exploded, kill their own families, fight until well beyond the time their brains should have told them they were dead. Not tonight, though. Tonight's raid wasn't about wanton violence, theft, or the acquisition of new disciples. Alma wanted something else. The crowd in front of him parted, and the man himself appeared. His form was hidden by a hooded rain poncho, but his eyes shone in the security lights.
"Gideon,"
Odongo said by way of greeting.
"Mukisa."
Odongo never spoke of the fact that he'd known Alma at university. Before the man's psychoses had reached such a pitched level, before he'd left to pursue his career as God's avenging angel. Alma looked over at his 6 hostages, absorbing the terror and despair in the faces of the ones capable of understanding what was happening. I was going to torture them in front of the director of this hospital, but now that I know it's you, there's no point, is there? What would you care? Your heart has always been empty. You live only by your calculations. Alma motioned toward the hostages, and a few of his men fired on full automatic. They threw their arms instinctively in front of their faces as they were mowed down. The screams that were their last act in this world went unheard, drowned out by the guns and rain. "See?" Alma said, pointing at Odongo. "Not even a flinch. You've already forgotten them, haven't you? You've already sifted through how their deaths affect your position, scenarios, strategies, tactics. You can't comprehend anything beyond that, can you? The smell of their fear, the warmth of their blood on the ground, the sorrow of their families." "I'm not one of your disciples, Gideon. Your oratory bores me as much now as it did when we were children. What do you want?" The cult leader's expression was still in shadow, but his eyes sharpened. "David Chisholm." "He's gone." "Do you remember me as being stupid?" "No. I remember you as being insane." Alma's followers continued to look at him with the expected awe, but in a few of them, that awe was marred by confusion. It was unlikely that they'd ever heard anyone speak to their Messiah as an equal, as a human being like the other 7 billion on the planet. Well, perhaps not like the other 7 billion, but also not a celestial creature in danger of sprouting wings and ascending into heaven. "Give him to me, and I'll make this easy on you, Mukisa. You have my word as God's representative on Earth." Odongo just smiled at that. He remembered the school-age Alma in terms somewhat less grand. But in one thing he was right. Quick would be better. Odongo reached for the knife hidden down the back of his pants, the one that Alma's children had sloppily missed. He charged, and as expected, the sound of gunfire erupted from behind. The impacts of the rounds on his back produced no pain, but had the unintended consequence of propelling him forward. Alma jerked unnaturally, and Odongo would have laughed if he'd had the time. The man's untrained troops had panicked and shot him. His blade penetrated the rain hood, getting tangled in the material before it could reach Alma's throat. More gunfire, more disorienting flashes, more impacts. Odongo's body had gone numb by the time it landed unceremoniously in the mud. He could no longer breathe, but he wasn't sure if it was because his mouth had sunk into the wet earth or because his lungs had been destroyed by the gunfire. Not that it mattered anymore. He'd done what he could. Gideon Alma scooted away from the knife in Mukisa Odongo's lifeless fingers. He looked down at his own arm and saw the blood streaming from where a bullet had grazed him. The pain was sharp, that of a trivial wound, and not the deep ache of a mortal one. Someone lifted him to his feet, and he found himself able to stand without difficulty. A further examination of the wound would have to wait. Concern over the flesh and blood shell that contained his spirit would be unseemly under the adoring gaze of his disciples. "Bullets can't harm me," he shouted through the beat of the rain and wail of the alarm reverberating through the hospital doors. His men broke from their stunned silence and cheered as he took a machete from one of them, wielding it with his uninjured arm. Alma didn't recognize the boy who had shot him, but he recognized the panic in his eyes. He recognized the power of it and how it turned the rest against him. They shouted demands for the blood of the boy who only moments ago had been their comrade. He swung the blade into the boy's arm, in roughly the same place he himself had been wounded. "Pick him up," he shouted when his victim's knees buckled. 2 men obeyed, and Alma continued his work with the machete. It was poorly maintained, making the effort greater than it should have been. Eventually, though, he was rewarded with the severed arm lying in the mud. "An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and an arm for an arm." This time he spoke quietly enough that only those closest to him would hear. But his words would be repeated to the others, and not only the ones who had accompanied him on this raid, to ones who had been left at the encampment. It would become part of his legend, part of his canon. "Find the white man." Alma's fighters averted their eyes as he strode through the hallway. They found nothing, but there was no way that Chisholm had escaped. The facility was surrounded. Every road and path was being watched. Every village where he could take refuge had been infiltrated. He was there. Of that Oma was certain. God had whispered it in his ear. But time was running out. Dawn was bearing down on them, and the rain was starting to abate. With the sunrise would come the Ugandan authorities. "Burn it," he told his second-in-command, a 19-year-old who had proved eminently loyal in the 7 years since Oma had captured him. "Start at the back. We'll drive him to us like an animal." Oma turned and started for the front of the building. It was hard to imagine what this would mean for his movement. Chisholm's benefactor would pay virtually anything to get him back, and with that money he could buy the weapons necessary to take Uganda. After that, Congo, and beyond. The ranks of his disciples would grow from a few hundred men huddled in the forest to millions living out in the open in cities and rural areas, paying tribute to him, spreading his message throughout the continent and the world. The word of God, the word of Gideon Oma. Smoke. I smell smoke. David Chisholm tried to find a more comfortable position on the hard floor, but there was none. Odongo had done his customary impeccable job of camouflaging the safe room, but hadn't given much thought to creature comforts. Basically a 6-foot cube with no furniture or lights. "Can you smell it?" Liu repeated in the darkness. "The smoke?" "I don't smell anything," Richie said. "It's because of your cigarettes," she responded, in a harsh whisper. "Your nose doesn't work now." "Shh," Chisholm said. "I think it's just your imagination, Jing."
This is really stressful.
His voice faltered when he realized that she was right. A moment later, a second alarm joined the one that had been wailing relentlessly since before Odongo had sequestered them in that hole. The pitch of it was familiar from the regular fire drills he'd insisted on. "They're going to burn us to death," she said. "Shit." "All right," Chisholm said. "You two stay put. I'm going to go have a look." No one spoke as he climbed the ladder, felt around for the latch, and then opened the hatch a crack. Odongo had replaced the bucket and mop, and Chisholm let them slide slowly back before crawling out. The door leading into the cafeteria was open a couple of inches, left that way by the brief search they'd heard earlier. He peered out at the lines of empty tables. Smoke was just barely visible, creating a haze that hung beneath a sprinkler system that must have been disabled. Not ideal. Chisholm stood and returned to the hatch, pulling it fully open. "Come up, we've got to get out of here." By the time they slipped into the cafeteria, the main lights were out, and the smoke was thick enough to burn his eyes. From now on, they'd be navigating by the red glow of emergency illumination. A quick peek into the hallway confirmed that it was empty and that the fire was at the back of the facility. "What?" Richie said. "What do you see?" "Too much," Chisholm responded. "What does that mean?" He pulled back and pressed himself against the wall, looking into the tearing eyes of his two companions. "There's no reason for Oma to come all this way to attack a hospital. And he set the back on fire. The front looks clear. What are you saying? That the only thing of value in this place is us. He makes his money stealing, drug dealing, and kidnapping locals. I figure he's going for the big score. What are we going to do?" "There aren't many choices," Chisholm admitted. "I figure he set the fire to try to flush us into the parking lot." "Well, he's waiting," Richie said. "Yeah." "Maybe we should go," Liu said. "He will ask for money. Mr. Ward will pay, and he will let us go." "No," Matteo Ricci said with surprising firmness. "You're the only thing here that's valuable, David. I will die a horrible death, and as a woman, Jing's will be unimaginable." "Agreed," Chisholm said. "So that leaves only one option. We go through the fire and out the back. They won't expect it, and they won't be waiting for us there." "We'll be burned to death," Liu said. "Nah, we'll be fine." "How can you say that?" "Because I'm super lucky." Chapter 1. The White House, Washington, D.C., USA. CIA Director Irene Kennedy stepped into the president's outer office and paused to take in her surroundings. The changes had continued in earnest since the last time she was there. The decor and artwork were even more modern, and now the carpet had been replaced with a wood floor that bounced sound around the room. The desk of the president's secretary, a barely controlled disaster over the last two administrations, was now the picture of minimalist, high-tech efficiency, as was the woman sitting behind it. The fact that so much effort was being put into something as trivial as redecorating suggested a return to what passed for normalcy in Washington. 6 months ago, a terrorist group had managed to take down the entire U.S. power grid and keep it down for more than a month. The consequences had been dire, with hundreds of thousands of Americans dead of cold, violence, and lack of medical care. Countless devastating fires caused by exploding electrical substations, sagging power lines, and desperate people trying to stay warm had raged throughout the country. And finally, the world's economy had collapsed in reaction to its most powerful engine being taken offline. The effects would reverberate for years, but the worst was over. Power had been restored to all but a few rural outposts in the Northwest. Critical manufacturing and agriculture were fully back online, and areas wiped out by fires were being rebuilt. After months of world governments being too focused on the crises in front of them to create new ones, moves were once again being made on the geopolitical chessboard, moves that it was her job to neutralize. "Dr. Kennedy?" the president's secretary said, glancing up from her monitor. "You can go in. He's expecting you." She entered an oval office that was all but unrecognizable. The wallpaper was gone, as were the traditional pleated curtains. Furniture had been updated to something that leaned toward mid-century modern, and artwork had slipped into the abstract. Only the resolute desk and flags remained. The man walking toward her seemed to fit perfectly with the environment he'd created. At 44, Anthony Cook was one of the youngest presidents in U.S. history. He'd managed to rise from the turmoil created by the suicide of his party's frontrunner, crushing the more conventional replacement candidates endorsed by the establishment. The American people had been fed up with business as usual for a long time, and that, combined with the hardship brought about by the electrical grid failure, had sent them on a search for someone different. Anthony Cook, for better or worse, was it. "Irene," he said, taking her hand, "it's good to see you." She wasn't sure that was entirely true. Her relationship with his predecessor had been one of mutual respect and occasionally even warmth. Cook seemed to be incapable of either. He was a ruthless man, though one with an admittedly impressive grasp of history and America's challenges going forward. A born politician who had spent his life immersed in that world, but who still managed to portray himself as an outsider. A common man who had infiltrated the political elite and was now positioned to transform it. None of this was necessarily bad. Politics was theater, and a fair amount of melodrama was necessary to get people to the polls, but what was behind the persona Cook had created? Where was he going? What did he want? Due to his understandable focus since he took office on putting America back on track, they hadn't interacted enough for Kennedy to get a true measure of the man. He pointed her toward a conversation area, and she made note of his broad shoulders, narrow waist, and full head of hair. In his years as a political strategist, he'd been very different. A scrawny intellectual with fiery charisma, a gift for picking winners, and an icy, realpolitik view of the average American. By the time he'd thrown his own hat into the ring, though, he'd reinvented himself. President Cook was good-looking, physically imposing, and impeccably dressed. He oozed concern for every one of the 330 million people under his care. He was the man with the answers, the man who would lead America into a future so bright it was blinding. "I'm not sure you know our guest, Irene." From behind, the man sitting on one of the sofas looked very much like everyone else in Washington. Blue suit, nice posture, expensive haircut with a little gray at the temples. But when he put down his coffee cup and stood, he proved to be much more than one of the political operatives that infested the Beltway. As the world's first trillionaire, Nicholas Ward needed little introduction. He was a genius in every sense of the word, who had stepped back from controlling his business empire to run a massive foundation that he charged with nothing less ambitious than solving the problems of humanity. Healthcare, renewable energy, employment, violence, poverty. If something had plagued society since the dawn of time, Ward figured he could fix it in the next 20 years. A bit optimistic in her estimation, but he was a hard man to dismiss. Impossible, really. "You look good, Nick. Africa seems to agree with you. Don't be fooled. It's all biting insects and sunburn." She leaned in, and he kissed her on the cheek. "I take it you do know each other." the president said, failing to hide a hint of irritation that Kennedy found a bit worrying. She hadn't been told what this meeting was about, or that the most powerful private citizen in the world would be in attendance. Had it been an attempt at a subtle power play that had now backfired? Not yet sure how to navigate the environment that Cook had created, she was grateful when Ward answered. Irene and I are in the same business. We both want to keep people safe and healthy. That's landed us at a few of the same conferences and participating on the same panels. He flashed the everyman smile that he was known for. I figure the fact that she hasn't had me killed yet makes us friends. Fairly close friends, in fact. Their relationship had been cemented by a recent bioterrorism event that she'd had no choice but to bring him in on. The long days, long nights, and logistical nightmares they'd faced had given her a healthy respect and personal affection for the man. He was one of the most impressive people she had ever met, and seemed to honestly have the good of mankind at heart. The fact that some of his views were a bit naive was more than overcome by his enthusiasm and almost supernatural competence. I heard what happened in Uganda, but the details that have reached my desk are still sketchy.